Thanks, everyone. Let's welcome our next panel. We had a fantastic first half, our discussion. Let's bring Jennifer Westacott from the BCA back. We've got David Borger with us from Business Western Sydney, Professor Andy Marks from Western Sydney University, and Dr. Andrew Charlton, member for Parramatta. Welcome to you all, and great to see you all. I'm going to go to Professor Marks, first of all, for this half. And I guess just something that jumps out at me from our conversation in the first half, the vignette we just played. Western Sydney's not coming from a standing start here, is it?
No, it's not a cold start, Kieran. It's a really good point. Western Sydney is all about momentum. So when we talk about frontiers, we're really talking about being at the edge of something exciting. And we're about a region that doesn't wait to be asked. So all of the things that we've talked about as being critical to unlock potential in Western Sydney, things around migration reform, labour market reform, being quick. And that's the big thing I took out of that first panel, being agile. You can do them in Western Sydney, I think, more in a way that's more cohesive than you might do in a more traditional setting like Sydney, Melbourne, etc., because it has that kind of frontier mentality. But I actually think that Western Sydney's strengths too, are around its stickiness, the things that make it great to live in this region. And they're things that we've got to amplify as well as all of the other considerations.
Andrew Charlton, how do you see Western Sydney's development thus far and also potential as a catalyst for growth on a national level?
Well, I think Western Sydney and specifically Parramatta have the potential to be Australia's next great global city. I mean, we already have significant scale here in Parramatta. If Parramatta itself was a country, it would be in the top 100 countries in the world by GDP. It's already a significant economy. And I think when you look forward to see what Western Sydney could become, the potential is all there. When you think about what makes a great city internationally, what are the ingredients that make a city really thrive? Why did Boston really progress through the last few decades, but Cleveland struggled? Why did Pittsburgh reinvent itself after the industrial era, but Detroit flounder? What's made Edinburgh and Manchester great successes while Newcastle and Sheffield have fallen behind? And I think the answer comes down to four things. It comes down to talent, investment, transport infrastructure, and culture. And all of those elements are right here in Western Sydney, and it's about bringing them together and creating a great global city.
Jennifer, how do you reflect on that? And I think the one that jumps out at me from what Andrew said there that's pivotal to everything is investment and to generate that capital.
Absolutely. So think about the airport. So that's, over $5 billion of investment. Sometimes governments have to do those things. I mean, simply to say to the private sector, form a consortium and get it done. It's not as easy as it sounds. So I think government has to sometimes lead investment like the airport. Government sometimes has to co-invest, which is my point about some of the machinery we're going to need. If we want to kind of develop a semiconductor capability, which I believe we need urgently in Australia because of big vulnerability, we're going to have governments co-investing. And then the point around investing in infrastructure, there's $20 billion just going in the Parkland City alone, the metro, and then you look around Parramatta, the huge amount of money that's gone in that David can talk more specifically about. But, this city is transformed. When I used to come out to Parramatta years ago, when I worked in the public service, in housing and community services, it was a kind of government town. The way to fix everything was to sort of send government agencies out, and what you ended up finding was a whole lot of public servants driving back into the cities to see their minister. And it just never had that. Now, you look around the skyline here, Aon, Deloitte, all of the big companies here, as well as the university, it's now just transformed completely. A world-class institution in the Powerhouse coming here. The ABC being located here, which I think is just a transformational decision. That brings culture, talent, production making. So I think Andrew's right. I think you get those things, those combinations of things, and then you start to get momentum. Where we failed in places where to Andrew's contrasting points, it's people have built business parks instead of cities. People have failed to connect places with each other. So one of my big obsessions is don't be obsessed about connecting the Parkland City back to the CBD of Sydney. No, let's connect Western Sydney because it's a city in its own right. Let's not think everything's sort of a subset of the CBD. When I look at those failures that Andrew's talked about, it's the lack of those things working together, and it's the lack of government with purpose. It's the kind of let's just see what happens and build a couple of things, and finally it's the lack of staying the course. So you see a lot of experimentation in Australia, works for about 5 years, and then everyone will get, it's like toady from Wind in the Willows, then move on to the next thing. And we've got to stop being toadies and doing stuff, and then we find the new shiny next thing. We've got to stay the course and see stuff through.
David Borgia, I know you've been an advocate for this area for a long time, and we'll talk about the challenges ahead, because there are in terms of transport and other things and skills, but tell us your pitch for this place already as a frontier economy.
Yeah, I mean, Parramatta is an overnight success that's taken about 30 years of trying. But I think the key issue here is talent. And one of the things that the market and business aren't always aware of, I mean, businesses are pretty good at determining where they should locate themselves. They locate themselves where they can get access to the things they need, and talent's one of them. But they can only do that on the basis of knowledge, and we don't always have perfect knowledge. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about Western Sydney and Parramatta in particular is just how quickly the workforce and young people in the area have become university students have graduated. So educational gain is really quick. Like in a decade, massive increases in the proportion of pre-qualified people. People probably don't realise it, but the highest suburb of PhDs anywhere in New South Wales is actually Westmead. So you have this sort of thick labour market, as economists would say, like Andrew, developing in Western Sydney. And so I think we need to work on that talent. One of the other areas that is really unknown is just how many tech workers live in Western Sydney, particularly in IT. There's 100,000 tech workers in Western Sydney. There's a belt between Blacktown and Parramatta, particularly from the subcontinent. We haven't developed the tech industry yet. So I think there are these opportunities really in relation to talent. And probably the other thing I've mentioned, just in terms of Andrew's 4 pillars, one of them is culture. I think we do have a good culture. We have a culture that doesn't recognise your school ties so much in Western Sydney, which isn't a bad thing. Probably where we need to learn more, though, is how we take risks. And there are many lessons we can take from places like Israel and Singapore around national risk-taking and individual risk-taking. And so I think the other challenge we've got is to try and encourage our kids, not just to do the safe thing, to be the profession. Professions are great, many professions, but maybe you could actually add a little more if you if we can become a startup region, or startup state, or startup nation.
It's interesting, Professor Marks, because I mentioned earlier, but I grew up 5 minutes down the road, and I was one of that sort of generation that just left and didn't come back. And I guess that's trying to keep that stickiness you talk about, is to say, okay, well, you don't have to go to make a career. You stay, and there are careers in Parramatta and in Bradfield, as Jennifer's articulated their vision for the metropolis. It's changed a great deal, hasn't it, in recent years? How do we entrench that in this region?
Well, you can always come back to Kieran. We'll always have
Thank
you.
you, man.
But look, that's so true. And in the race to be quick, and we do have to be quick in reskilling and all of those things that we've talked about, we have to be careful that we're not too narrow. Now, by that I mean there's a STEM imperative, right? It's critical that we support the skills uplift and the supply chain connections that we've spoken about through better STEM capacity in the labour workforce. But one of the things we can't do is lose sight of the wild cards, the things that give us bandwidth. And we talked about some other skills around strategy and around marketing, etc., in the previous panel. But let's bring the artists into the fold as well. So what are the things that make Western Sydney attractive, and what are the things that actually unlock innovation? And you don't get innovation, I said earlier, by having a whole lot of engineers locked in a room, as pleasant as that might be for engineers. You get that innovation when you have somebody else come into the space and flip the problem on its head. And artists are fantastic for that. So I might be more of an advocate for STEAM than STEM. And I think we were on a unity ticket there. Certainly that's been the target at Bradfield and places like that. But what makes Western Sydney a great place to live? Because there's a big chunk of our lives we spend outside of that professional domain. And I think of all of the things that I love about Western Sydney, the Bankstown Poetry Slam, great stadiums. I won't venture too far into stadiums policy. It's great Parramatta's got one. No comment on some of the others. But those things that actually make, your life worth living. And that's the arts, that's culture, that's the fourth pillar. You've invented some pillars here today. It's good. Pillars are always good. So I think they're the things that we've got to think about as well. And Western Sydney won't wait to be asked. A lot of the best arts movements in Western Sydney, Sweatshop, and again back to the Poetry Slam, they're underground movements. They're not facilitated by large chunks of government funding. David Borgia knows very well the raw deal Western Sydney gets around arts funding at the national and state level. The Powerhouse is great for Western Sydney, but it's just a start. It's just a start.
Andrew, I know you've done a lot of work on this, but the future of work and the future of employment, how do you see this region tapping into all that can offer?
Well, I think there's a huge opportunity. Western Sydney has the potential to be the place where people can have a great job and afford a home without a huge commute between the two. And there are some things that are making that opportunity more challenging, obviously the rising cost of housing, but there are also many forces that are making that opportunity closer within our reach. And one is the future of work. Not just, as David and Jennifer and others have spoken about, the growth in good jobs in Parramatta, Deloitte being here, KPMG, QBE, the ABC. We have 1 million square metres of office space right here in Parramatta, and that is doubling over the next 5 years. So that opportunity to have good jobs located here in Parramatta is a crucial part of what will make this a great place to live and work. And I think the way that work is changing also opens that opportunity. And Jennifer talked about public servants who would be in Parramatta and then drive in to see their minister for an hour-long meeting, probably in many cases. Now lots of those meetings can happen not just between Parramatta and the CBD, but between Parramatta and the world online. So it opens up a premium. There used to be such great agglomeration economics in specific locations where you had to be where the specific action was in your industry. And the future of work is changing that. I don't think it means that agglomeration isn't a factor anymore. I think there are still many, many place-based factors which will drive economic success, but it means that those factors are changing. And they're less about just being in the traditional CBD and more about what does your location have to offer. What does it have to offer in terms of access to talent and universities? What does it have to offer in terms of access to new investment, to culture, to sport? Those are the things that will drive those new agglomeration economics, and I think Western Sydney has all of those ingredients.
Jennifer, I'm sure you'd agree with that, because that sort of seems to encapsulate a lot of what we're talking about with the Parkland City.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Andrew did this magnificent work for us at the Business Council many years ago, where there was this kind of starting to run perception that technology, automation was going to see mass job destruction. And what that report showed was that was not going to be the case. But what we were going to see is massive task change and rapid task change and rapid task rechange. But that's an opportunity. So people who've been traditionally shut out of industries, now the task change, now the competencies change, now you've got the opportunity for people to rapidly reskill and get into areas that they previously haven't got into. And then to Andrew's point, I think, and this is a really important point, when you build cities like Bradfield, so we'll be building obviously an advanced manufacturing research facility, CSIRO will be there, universities will be there, we'll be building hotels, we're going to build a central park, we'll be building housing, we'll be building retail, we've got a new metro line going, we're building a city, not a business park. And that will have this kind of enormous diversity of jobs, and that's what's happened in Parramatta. It's the diversity of jobs, it's the ecosystem of jobs. And it's not just all the kind of super high-tech jobs, it's making sure you've got the kind of flow-on effect of an ecosystem, to use that expression, where lots of people have got lots of opportunities. The other point that David and I were just talking about over lunch is I think there's a real opportunity for Parramatta to differentiate itself. So if you sort of think about Andrew's example of places that fail and succeed, is to start to kind of think about branding. What are we famous for? And we were just talking about this, this is just my idea, because it's something that really drives me crazy in Australia. Why isn't this the 24-hour city? right? Like, because this drives me mental in Sydney, that you go out to the theatre, you think, we'll go out for dinner, look around, you think, yeah, let's go home and heat something up. And we could do that in Parramatta, right? We could say Parramatta is going to be the place where, and then you go down to Harris Park, the best, Ross Green and I, as you know, are kind of wanting to make a TV series about this. You go down and you have the best Indian food you're ever going to eat in Australia, just here. So I think we've got, a lot of this is about promotion as well, and making sure that people are aware. And the final point is, I think part of the challenge for Western Sydney is this kind of mentality, and you can talk about this better than I can, that's out there and we better look after it. No, people are so proud to live in Western Sydney. They're not embarrassed. This is like their home. This is the place they love living. The only injustice, what I call the great unfairness, is the distribution of money. So what I'm calling for is that as the population grows, the percentage of infrastructure funds follows that growth. And it follows it not just in roads and infrastructure, but it follows in culture, in education, in schools. And that's the great inequity that has to be solved by both levels of government, because all the ambition, all the pride that's here, if it's constrained by what I call a great unfairness in resource allocation, then it will just take too long.
How is that inequity overcome?
I think Jennifer's right in that Western Sydney residents, they don't need to be saved. They're very proud of where they live. I think one of the things that's going to drive this is population growth. So effectively, we've got a planning system in Sydney in particular where growth is suppressed around where a lot of the really good jobs have been located closer towards the inner city, the inner west, the eastern suburbs and the North Shore, and residential growth has exploded in Western Sydney. Some people don't like that. I actually see that as an opportunity to create new agglomerations and density, and that's going to bring us opportunity, but it's also going to bring us political will. I mean, every election, governments and oppositions have to have the Western Sydney agenda. I think those agendas are getting bigger, and in a sense, Western Sydney is becoming too big to ignore. And as a region, it's very well networked, and it's very good at advocating and representing itself collectively. So I think there's some really good opportunities to make sure that we don't get left behind in the way that we have been in the past. I've got to say, we do face one other great challenge, Kieran, on Friday night in beating North Queensland.
Yeah, don't worry, Mitchell Moses will do that for us, mate. Don't worry, go the Eels. And Professor Marks, let's talk about the sort of the cultural story that you and I were chatting about over lunch as well. And it's hard to pick, isn't it? If you look at the political voting patterns in recent times, I think politicians have missed the mark in some respects in some of the campaigns. Give us your reflections on that, because I think it's interesting in the context of this broader cultural story that we're talking about. Jennifer spoke about the great Indian food. I know there's a big Chinese Australian presence in this part of the world, and the best Lebanese, food, as a biased person myself as well in this part of the world. But we're talking about a cultural presence here that sometimes I think people find it hard to pinpoint.
Yeah, that's right. And I think they've failed to see Western Sydney politically, as an asset. And the old narratives that the major parties would once apply to the great battleground of Western Sydney electorally don't apply. And you see the outcomes of that in really volatile voting behaviours, both at the state and federal level. The last 2 or 3 elections, when you've seen sort of national swings like this, in Western Sydney, they've been like this. You saw the most marginal electorate in Australia in Macquarie go from, nearly 0 up to 7%, 2PP for Labor. You've seen other shifts. You've seen a little bit of a surge in the Liberal vote in Lindsay out near Penrith against all of the odds federally. So, Western Sydney's moving fast in terms of its political opinions as well. We've heard already that it's a younger population than most other areas of Australia. But it's a mistake to think it's not politically engaged, and it's a mistake to think it's conservative as well. I've seen a lot of people talk about how Western Sydney will be a challenging space to get the First Nations voice to Parliament argument through. It's your easiest space, because if you grant them the intelligence of explaining the position, this is the region with Australia's largest Indigenous population. It should succeed here before it succeeds anywhere else. So the trouble has been, though, that politically Western Sydney's been the target of narrowcasting. We saw arguments around gender-based issues before the election. And, the major parties dug deep. One major party in particular, in Fowler, into Reid, into southwestern Sydney electorates, where they thought, oh, you know what, I've got a social conservative angle I can prosecute here. It's a mistake. It's a real mistake to do that. You need to speak to Western Sydney intelligently. You'll see those voter patterns start to settle down, and you'll see that engagement really ramp up. That's how you get cynicism out of politics. You talk to people straight. And the very last point, Kieran, I think I mentioned to you as well also, was the things that won the day, Labor and Liberal alike, mostly Labor this time round, were when politicians engaged locally. This was a street-by-street election. It wasn't a national agenda election. That's coming now in government. But this was one forward about what's happening over the fence, what's happening down the road. And that says everything about Western Sydney.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. And Andrew Charlton, something to go to that sort of culture question that I'd love to get your reflections on as a local member, someone that has seen the schooling, the education system. I know we spoke about the inequity in infrastructure, but some of the best schools and passionate teachers you'll find anywhere, right here.
Yeah, I think Parramatta is a real education success story, and when we talk about those factors that make cities great, that lead to the rejuvenation of cities, education is one of the main pathways. Think about Edinburgh, think about Pittsburgh, think about Boston, and Parramatta has those ingredients now. There are 9 university campuses in Parramatta, obviously the great Western Sydney University, but many others as well. And coming here for the obvious and simple reason that this is where the growth of talent is. This is where the access to students in the 21st century will come from. This is where the talent and innovation growth will be. And so, if Jason Clare was sitting here, he would be saying the same thing. We need to make sure that all Australian universities, not just Western Sydney, all New South Wales universities, are adding capacity where the growth of talent is, and that's right here.
Yeah, absolutely. Professor Marks, can you give us your reflections on that as someone at the coalface?
Oh, look, I think it's no, you don't need to be a genius to say that education's your best pathway, through socio-economic disadvantage and into growth. Parramatta is a great illustration of that. Next door in Reid, the electorate, Sally Situ's taken, again, very highly educated population, very diverse culturally population as well. Bradfield can be that. It can be that, but it has to be the best at everything. We can't have this attitude that, as Jennifer spoke about before, that that's something to be dealt with over there, Western Sydney. It's not, because Western Sydney's stopped thinking about itself relative to Sydney. In the main, Western Sydney's thinking about Singapore, it's thinking about Southeast Asia, and it's comparing itself on that playing field. And how do we muscle up for that? Education. Any day of the week. Of course I would say that, but in saying that, I say that TAFE needs support. TAFE needs that intensity of resource and investment. Apprenticeships need that intensity of resource and investment. And to the other point that's been made, I've said earlier on that 59% roughly of Australia's university students are women. And that figure is not reflected in the workforce. You've got such latent capacity, and one of our questioners from the Centre for Western Sydney raised it earlier, Ray Duffy-Jones, around how do we bring that capacity back in? And to my earlier point, in Western Sydney you can do it, because you're not constrained by the old boardroom conventions of Sydney and Melbourne, Canberra, etc. You can do radical stuff here, and you can move fast.
David Borgia, your reflections on that?
Yeah, look, I think certainly at the university level, it's very clear. There's a great study which actually shows that if you go right back to the University of Bologna, which might have been the first university in the world, all universities raise regional income. It's an absolute guaranteed, surefire way of raising income within a region. But scientific universities raise them much more. And so I think one of the challenges that we've got in Western Sydney is how do we actually develop those scientific and technical dimensions of engineering and informatics and so on within universities that are here, particularly Western Sydney Uni. And I think, when I first started my job, actually the most competitive members that we had were universities with each other. I'm kind of seeing a sort of, this sort of springtime now in universities where Summer of Love, thanks Andy, is happening. And we're seeing collaboration. So University of New South Wales and Western Sydney Uni, for example, are working together. They're in the same building. It's a sort of engineering architecture built sciences building. So I think we need a lot more of that to respond to the needs that Jennifer's going to be creating and companies are going to be creating in Bradfield.
Yeah, and just on that, Jennifer, we've been talking about the opportunities. I just want you to reflect on any potential roadblocks out of the Aerotropolis and the airport that we have to keep an eye out on.
I think the main thing is you've got to stay the course. I think, this is like a 22nd century city. And I think the temptation is always to do what we always do in Sydney and say, oh, let's do another housing development. Let's do the same housing development that we've done forever, as opposed to actually let's think about the housing product. Let's think about how we build houses. Let's think about why we aren't prefabricating. Why aren't we developing technologies in Australia that allow houses to be built faster with better materials, with more energy efficient materials? And as I said earlier, what I want Bradfield to be is that place where people go, that is the place in the world where you see the most efficient housing. But it's also about housing typology, which is about affordability. So I think the challenge is to stay the course, which is why people set up authorities so that these things don't get caught up in political processes. And of course adjust and change over time and not be rigid, because this is going to be, we're going to be doing this city for a long period of time. And the world is just going to go around, millions of times in terms of technology. The only other point I'd make in a broader thing, which we haven't talked about, it went to the question that was asked earlier, and we'll come back to that later. There are still big inequalities in broader Western Sydney that have to get fixed. I mean, I was the director of housing in Victoria and the deputy here, and grew up in public housing. And, I can name those suburbs where kids like me are not going to get those opportunities unless we as a system of people make interventions, and education is the key. And it's not just going to be a university system. It's going to be, how do you get the school system working better? How do you fix for failure? Which is why one of the really important things that the ACTU and the BCA pushed at the summit was a kind of rejuvenation of foundation studies. How do you make sure that people have got multiple pathways, that they don't get stuck in a pathway? And how do we make sure that we're thinking about industrial land close to areas? So that's my nervousness. The temptation is to always give it away, and then you find you don't have enough land for the jobs. You've given away to the kind of old housing types that create unaffordability, that create big infrastructure lags. We've got to get different thinking about cities and about planning. But I don't want to kind of, downcast this too much. But there are still many people in those old housing estates that I used to visit on a regular basis whose lives are not good, and they are not getting better. They're getting worse. And as a society, we just can't keep to saying we're going to kick that problem down the road. We've got to do something about it.
And at the moment, I've got to say there is no plan. There is no plan to salt and pepper those legacy public housing estates where 97% of people are out of work, and where, they're the forgotten people really, and we need to do something about it.
Yeah, and there are, but it does require investment. It does require capital. But the idea that, like if I think about when I grew up in public housing, everyone in our street worked. Not always great jobs. My parents had jobs, not careers. They weren't fantastic jobs, but everyone had a job. When my mother left that public housing estate, nobody worked. Nobody worked in that street. And, you can't give kids hope and, a prospect for life if they never see anyone going to work. And, I think that's the bit of fixing that is going to require sustained effort, huge investment, but we can't keep kicking it down the road, because that's talent. Like I have this passionate belief, every kid has a gift. Every kid is gifted. And the challenge, is to make sure that we stop failing those gifted kids. And, and we stop failing gifted people, which we'll come back to that question that was asked earlier. But I don't want to, I don't want to be in a black hat, but we can't ignore that there are suburbs where if you are born in those suburbs, your chances of success are not good. I think you and I agree on that, David, I think.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there's great evidence in America. There was a program called Moving to Opportunity where they moved kids out of the big projects in Boston and New York and Philadelphia to better places. And these economists found that there was this magic age, which was 13. So if a child was able to move out of, you know, the badlands, the tough areas, to a better area before the age of 13, there were measurable improvements to their life chances, to their longevity, to their education, to their employment, to their incarceration rates, to their emergency ward admissions. After 13, it wasn't as noticeable. So I think if we're going to target, let's provide opportunities to those children that Jennifer's talking.
I agree with that to a point, David. I think that's exactly right. But I think let's not move them out. Let's move things into them. But I agree.
Okay, let's turn our attention back to some of the, and I want to get some questions from the floor, including we'll get back to our previous questioner in a moment. But just before we do, I want to ask Andrew Charlton about this, the Aerotropolis, the prospects, because you mentioned transport as being a key factor. How do you see transport and the production, the distribution of services evolving in this part of the world with the new airport?
Well, we have some big new infrastructure projects here in Western Sydney. Obviously, we've got the light rail, stage 1, potentially stage 2. Not making any announcements. We've got the new metro, but transport links are absolutely critical. Many of you will have travelled to Avalon Airport near Geelong, and that is a cautionary tale for those of us in New South Wales building an Aerotropolis. Avalon is not that badly located. It's relatively close to the big centre of Geelong. If you were going to put a second airport around Melbourne, it's not a crazy place to put that second airport. It's been there for a long time. It had serious industry there at different points. It had Qantas's maintenance there. But right now there's a lot of tumbleweed. It gets not much more than 6 or 7 flights a day. And that is an airport that has a long history and isn't poorly located. I think what Jennifer said is absolutely right. You need to put all the elements in place, not just one. And one of the elements that Avalon is missing, and we cannot miss from the Aerotropolis in Sydney, is transport links. And if we don't have the transport links, then we'll be in a similar situation to Avalon, where it just doesn't have all the elements of connectivity, city, industry, residential that make it great, and it will decline as Avalon has declined. So I think we should be very conscious that what we're trying to do in terms of building a city is a challenging thing to do. Many people have tried and failed in the past, and there are examples of failure all over Australia and all over the world. And Jennifer's right. Staying the course, putting all the elements together gives us the best chance of success.
We've got some questions from the floor. We'll go back to Lisa Middlebrook from Sydney University. If you could repeat your question.
Now we can hear. Thank you for the opportunity to ask the question again. A couple of people have come up to me in the break supporting the question, so I think I've struck a bit of a chord. We have historically low unemployment rates at the moment, but it only tells part of the story. Unemployment rates for those under 25 and those under 50 is considerably higher. And how do we work together to address those issues? And how do we work together to convince employers, both small employers and small business and large multinationals, that we can work together to make the whole breadth of the human experience a part of lifelong learning and work? And striking a chord, my earlier part of the question was the fastest rates of homelessness in Australia are generally with women over 50. We talk about getting women in the workforce, and we talk a lot about childcare, but getting women back into the workforce if they haven't worked for a while, this is part of the issue. So I'd love to hear any thoughts about working, as I said, with lifelong learning and how we can change this.
Let's start with Professor Marks, and we'll just get everyone's thoughts on it.
Thanks, Kieran. Thanks. It's an excellent question. We've failed. We're failing in critical areas. So the fundamental thing that gets tossed around under that term livability, you're failing if you can't create affordability for older women and for so many other cohorts in Western Sydney and Greater Sydney more broadly, and we are failing because that number is getting greater. Domestic violence is another issue, of course, as well, that needs to be addressed with urgency. So when we talk about being quick, we've got to be quick at those things. But unemployment, youth unemployment in parts of Western Sydney, I know Andrew knows this even within his own electorate, it defies trends in the wrong way. So when we have great levels of qualification, PhD concentrations in Westmead, 5 minutes away, you've got double-digit youth unemployment. Maryland's, Granville, etc., and pockets there. Southwestern Sydney, again, Macquarie Fields, Mount Druitt, Tregear, Wilmot, those areas have entrenched youth unemployment that defies all of the trends. That's an urgent issue. That's the most urgent issue of all. And I think to Jennifer's earlier point as well, and the panel's talked about the importance of early childhood and interventions in education. That's where you can affect the most difference. And we need policies with commitment that sign governments up to targets and make industry and universities responsible as well. We're all part of addressing this issue. And when we talk about Western Sydney being a frontier place, let's make it a frontier place where we actually lead on addressing those issues. Let that be the thing that we're known for and the flag that we plant. To the last point, big infrastructure projects like what we're seeing at Bradfield are a great way to leverage that, make it an exemplar and affordable housing for older women. And don't make unaffordable housing the sign of a virtuous or great city. It's not. It's a sign that a city's failed. It's a sign that it's failed. Let's not let that happen in Western Sydney.
Thank you for your question, and you're absolutely right. If you jump in the car from this spot and drive a few kilometres north to the top of this electorate in North Rocks, the unemployment rate is 1.8% and the youth unemployment rate is about 4%. If you get back in the car and drive a few kilometres south of here to the bottom of this electorate to South Granville, the unemployment rate is 15% and the youth unemployment rate is nearly 30%. So there are enormous inequities even within a few miles, even within small pockets of Western Sydney. Now, there are lots of things we need to do to change that, but one of the things is rethinking our education model. We still have it's wonderful that the levels of education have gone up. It's wonderful that we've had such an expansion in university participation, but we still have an education model in this country where 90% of the hours of education that you get in your life, you're getting before the age of 21. And yet that is a model which we had when people lived much shorter lives, when careers were much more linear, where we were bringing people through education systems, giving them a degree very early on in their life, slapping a debt to that degree and wishing them well for the rest of their career. Now, with how rapidly tasks are changing within work, how many times people will have to reinvent their own career within jobs and across jobs, we need to think about how do we get education that is fit for purpose for that new style of work. And that involves a big mindset change. It involves a big change in the delivery models for education and a big change in the type of people we think about as candidates for education, including people in this electorate who probably not the typical candidate that's going to rock up to a university and do a 3-year degree. They don't have the opportunity to do that. The rest of their life doesn't enable them to do that. So how do we create education delivery models that help those people, give them the skills they need to get into the workforce, break that cycle of unemployment, and tap into the huge talent potential that we have in Western Sydney?
Yeah, look, it's a fantastic question, which is why I didn't want to kind of just give it a sort of quick answer before lunch, because it's the most important question. So just to add to a couple of those things, so just to re-prosecute a little bit more on education. So there's a few things. We've got to get serious in this country about early childhood education, and all the evidence now is in. By 5, if you are not digitally competent, if you are not able to do a whole lot of things, your life chances are going to be pretty difficult. So you can't always fix people's family circumstances, but boy, you can fix what they do at school. The second is the school model itself. I chair a thing called Studio Schools Australia, which is for Indigenous kids in the middle years in Northern Australia. And I was up at one of the schools a few weeks ago and thought, why aren't we doing this around the country? So it has an 80% graduation rate and a 90% attendance rate. Across Fitzroy Crossing, the area where most kids go to school. School of five, that is built for 500 kids, 40 kids go to that school. We've got 90% attendance. Now, our school is a residential school, but it's the 80% completion that I'm interested in. Why? It's a completely different way of teaching kids. Project-based learning, in re-engaging them in the education process, individual pathways. We should also be thinking about what do we give kids when they graduate. So what we give them at the moment is a mark that tells them that you're hopeless or you're not hopeless. And that's how kids see it, right? And that's why those last 2 years of school are very traumatic for a lot of people. We give kids, like at our studio schools, kids don't get A, B's and C's. They go, you're getting better at that. You could do, like it's a completely different model for disengaged kids. But why can't we, when kids leave school, say you get 3 things? You do need a mark, because a university or a TAFE has to be able to rank you. You do need those 3 foundational, numeracy, digital and literacy. But why aren't we counting those evidence-based things of workability skills, teamwork, communication? Why aren't we counting that you volunteered or you worked at Macca's? Why aren't we counting, particularly in Western Sydney, that you can speak another language? So my grandson speaks fluent Farsi, but he's learning Italian at school, and he says to me, why am I doing this? I already speak fluent Farsi. So that's hugely important. There's just a couple of other things you raised, which are just so important. You know, like older women out of the workforce. Well, we've suggested as the BCA that there be a skills guarantee for older women to re-enter the workforce. And that particularly is around getting them digitally competent, because if you can't be digital, there's pretty much no job you can get. Why aren't we giving people a foundation skills guarantee? And then on homelessness, you know, I could do another panel for 5 days on housing system, but you know, we've got to find a way of breaking down this cycle of it's an all or nothing. You know, you're either in public housing or you're really destitute. There's got to be a middle way here, and lots of people have done work on it. And then finally, the employment services model, which basically sends people to work, to get jobs which they are not suited for, that they are not able to do. We've got to shift that to a demand model, which our companies are up for, where instead of being sent off to a job that is just demoralising, you're invited to a job, and then services are wrapped around you. And you change that model completely for people, because, and we should be doing that, to your point, we should be doing that right now. One of the pilots that came out of the summit was something on disability that the BCA will pilot with the government on. But we should be doing that now, because once you're in work, you're probably going to stay in work. But we've just got to completely rethink the way those employment services work, and get out of this demoralising, here's 5 jobs to apply for and you don't get any of them, and start to think about job design. Like, why are we asking for some of these? Like, you know, if you had Dylan Alcott here, you'd do a much better job than I'm going to do of this. But asking people for a driver's licence to do a desk job, right, which excludes a whole pile of people with disabilities. Why are we doing that? Why aren't we designing jobs to get the best people? To Steve's point, I just want people who are really good at stuff. And, you know, so it's a long answer to your question, but it's an important question, because if we don't bring everyone with us on this journey, the community will reject it pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question was about particularly youth unemployment and older women. I think in terms of youth unemployment, there are some young kids who really struggle with the school system and drop out, and they often do live in public housing estates, although not exclusively. There are programs now that can work with those young men and women, and apparently they learn on the job much better than in the classroom. And those programs can then be tied to the massive infrastructure. I mean, we're going to hit national peak infrastructure spend in 2027. So this is the best possible time to solve these problems. We have full unemployment, 3.4 or 5%, the highest participation rate in history. We've got employers that are looking and searching and scouring the market for opportunities. So now's the time to actually fix the problem. I would say the earlier point around, you know, breaking up the big old public housing estates could actually help us with productivity and jobs. If people are going to a school or a childcare centre where there are lots of different people of different abilities, they're more likely to raise their expectation levels. And I'd also say, you know, the other great challenge is migrants, and we haven't really touched on migrants, but only half of skilled migrants are working in the area that they have a skill in. That can't be productive. Now, I think 2 things are interesting. One is, of course, professional associations need to play a fundamental role in working out whose qualifications will be recognised because they are the experts. But they also have a conflict of interest in creating a closed shop and reducing the labour supply and increasing the price of their own effort. So I think the Productivity Commissioner, nationally or state, really needs to look at this to make sure we're actually making the right decisions. And secondly, I think there is a bit of discrimination in the employment market. I think it's unconscious often. I think we do need to make sure we know what are those soft skills that we say, oh yes, the person will be great, but they haven't got the soft skills, they're too direct, or they're not picking up on they wouldn't fit in with the team, We make all these judgments. So there are ways of training to be provided for soft skills, and companies could actually take the lead in the first stage of employment and actually do we really need to know your postcode and your surname and your religion? I mean, is it that important? Of course you're going to have an interview later on, you'll get to see these people and make your own assessment, but let's try not to have this unconscious bias. We're excluding someone because we just make this judgment call, will they really get on with the team?
Thank you, David, and the rest of the panel. We have time for one more question to wrap things up.
Thank you. Elfa Moraitakis, CEO of Syd West Multicultural Services, proud service provider in Western Sydney, as you can tell from our name, and not a lot of imagination there. So we do provide, we're a leading service provider in Western Sydney, and amongst many other things, we assist people to settle in Western Sydney, new and emerging communities. I appreciate Jennifer, touching upon the parklands and community consultations. Also, I hear a lot about diversity and culture. I wanted to ask, in your conversations between industry, academia, businesses, how does the community voice and representation looks like, if there is any, if it has been considered? And wouldn't it be great when we talk about the co-design and the future of Western Sydney to actually have all these plus community in the planning of this beautiful region?
Thank you very much.
Well, I think certainly that's one of the things we are absolutely committed to doing. It's not easy to do this though, as you know, because many people have many voices, and you've also got to make a set of decisions. But we're keen to get ideas too, because I think the most important thing is when we talk about co-design, sometimes I think institutions need some help in thinking about co-design, and I'm certainly really committed to doing that, but we've got to do it in a way that is inclusive and is innovative. Like, we don't just do the same old thing, have a workshop that everyone comes to, people put stuff on whiteboards and we say that's consultation. That's not consultation. What does perfect look like? I don't know, to be honest, because I think we've all had lots of goes at this and it's been moderately successful. So I'm really open to ideas. And I think the most important sort of way that we can do this, and everyone else on the panel have views about this, is I think we've always got to remember who we're there to serve, and we're not there to serve ourselves. And we've got to think about, when we talk about stakeholders, to me, it's about we're there to serve people, and we're there to try and reflect as much as we can through co-design, through consultation, to talking about, what I've said as our kind of core purpose is to serve the people of the Parkland City. And I think getting that culture in our universities, in our institutions, in government, I think it sounds obvious, but I think it's the biggest shift we have to make, is that concept of, we're actually here to serve.
Professor Mark?
Thank you. Look, you guys do great work. So firstly, thanks for everything you do. You're managing Western Sydney's greatest asset. Look, I often am struck when we have graduations at Western Sydney Uni that guests to those graduation ceremonies will say, gee, you must have a really big international student population. We don't. We have one of the smallest in the country. It's just Western Sydney. Western Sydney's face is diverse, and any graduation ceremony I love for that reason. The mums and dads and everyone that comes through the room, that's the transformation in action. And Jennifer, you're going to get to see that, of course, in coming years, and we're so excited about that. I think the other element here is that we're at a tipping point in Western Sydney, and it's one, I reckon, in which we can go two ways. And I'm thinking of the better nature of Western Sydney is that we'll accept multiculturalism as an asset and not just have a tolerance lens or a diversity lens. It'll be like, look at this, look at what we got. You know, it's the best thing. And I think actually we're getting to that point, and we saw some negativity in the lockdowns. I heard a particular politician, no names, refer to Fairfield as a problem area. And they were just, no, look, they were just talking about it in terms of public health orders, etc. But we got to this point where they said, well, you're not talking to us. And I'd love to see situations in Western Sydney where the identity is celebrated so much that we have stuff in language, so that when I go to parts of Western Sydney, I struggle. I want to struggle to read messaging. I want to be the guy that's feeling like, gee, I really got to get my head around this. Now we're asking our migrant and refugee residents to come our way, all our way. I reckon it's time, you know, guys like me and others in the room walked a little bit more their way. And that was a good moment for us to see what they've been experiencing. And it's not good enough. So I hope we're going to tip the right way. I think we will.
David?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, El, for a co-design and making sure those other voices that aren't sitting around the board table get a look in the way we spend money and the way we design particularly public projects. So I think a really good example of that is the Powerhouse Museum in Parramatta. So this is it'll be close to $1 billion worth of construction and fit-out value by the time it's done. The largest, I mean, we haven't done this since the Opera House. This is not business as usual every year. It's been decades before we've made such a big investment. I think it'll be the largest museum by floor space anywhere in Australia. And so, and what's the one criteria for success in a museum or a gallery? It's patronage. Do people come? Do they want to come? If they're not coming, it's unsuccessful. So the challenge we've got here is a population which has been a long way to the shop to get a sausage roll, but a long way also to get to the art gallery and everywhere else. And suddenly they're going to have an institution on their doorstep. So we need them to use it. So we're working really hard with Pacifica communities, First Nations communities, many migrant groups to say, you know, even the Greek community, can we bring your festival to our museum? And can you tell us what you're interested in, what you want? There's some things that are universal. You know, if we have an exhibition around space exploration, I think everyone's interested in that. But we just need to be mindful that this is a diverse community, and the programming's got to be diverse as well, or we will not get that patronage up.
Andrew, any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I'll give a final thought, and I guess if this is the last question, I just want to say thank you to the Business Council of Australia and to Jennifer and to David and Business Western Sydney for having this conversation here in Parramatta. To the business audience, I want to say and acknowledge those of you who have built businesses in Parramatta, brought good jobs to Parramatta, high skill, high wage jobs, to be part of the excitement that you see around you. And to any of the businesses who are not in Parramatta, I urge you to come out here, locate good jobs here, be part of the growth of Sydney's future, because if you're not here, you are missing out on the pipeline of talent that we've talked about. You're missing out on the future of Sydney that we've talked about, and I'll be happy to give you a walk around if you come out. Thanks very much.
Thank you to all of our panel, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for being here.